Okay, there you have it. Maghrib time at Islamabad and the most beautiful mosque in the world, Shah Faisal Masjid. Just look at the absolute scenery behind. We've got the Margla Hills, we've got the masjid with its pyramids, and Maghrib Namaz is going on at the moment. You probably can slightly hear it in the background. It's around about 5:40 in Islamabad here. It's absolutely scenic. Shah Faisal Masjid, you probably know about, guys. Shah Faisal of Saudi Arabia. In the 70s, he donated this mosque to us. With his money, it's all Saudi money, and he built something which is unbelievable. Oh! Total serenity, total enjoyment, total fulfillment of peace. I'm having a great time. Islamabad, I love you. I can stay here for the rest of my life in retirement. Look at the scenery in the background. Margla Hills, Maghrib ka time, Faisal Mosque in the background, lit up. I'm on a beautiful, lovely tree here, and it's obviously winter time. Wow. Let's have a relaxment. The moon is out, you can see it. On the rules and regulations. We're slightly late for the Maghrib prayer, but we're going to try to get whatever we can. It's all lit up. The whole masjid only lights up while during prayer. Now we've come upstairs, and you can see the view here. It's looking all the way around the Margla Hill. Look at this beautiful lighting here, and from here you can actually see Centaurus. Surprisingly, even though we're on February the 1st, it's absolutely chilling. It's very cold. Huh? You see right at the top there, right at the top, it's the restaurant Manal. And look at the background. Again, everyone, we're right on the left-hand side of the mosque. And if you look there, you can see during the summer, all this is full of water. So it's like a swimming pool. Absolutely beautiful environment here. You've got the Margla Hills in the background on your right. You've got the lush trees of Islamabad. You've got the lighting of the mosque here, which, from what I know, holds thousands and thousands of people. Look at that. One of the 4 pillars of the Shah Faisal Mosque. We've managed to get a really good view here. You just look at the scenery and the viewpoint of the Shah Faisal Mosque, one of the most sensational wonders of the world. Come and view, come and see Pakistan, and come and see and read namaz here. You will be absolutely enthralled. All you Westerners from the USA to Canada to UK to Germany to France to Europe, come and see our beautiful Islamabad. Look at the iconic Shah Faisal Mosque in the background. You will not be disappointed. Come and see the Nea Pakistan. There you go. Just look at this, right in the middle of the roads. We're sitting here, we're chilling, lovely light. It's Friday night at the movies. Look at this, sensational, beautiful greenery. Pakistan Zindabad, guys. Come and enjoy yourself in Pakistan. You'll have a sensational time. I promise you the world. Pakistan is the place to go. It's the #1 destination. There you go. I can sit here all day and chill. Whoa! F7. If you look at the flowers behind you, nice and colourful, goes lovely with my chadar. Look at this. Just look at the colours and combinations. This reflects our country, Pakistan. Beautiful, colourful. The fragrance is sensational. Its smell is beautiful. I can stay here all night. I think I feel like sleeping with these guys. Wow. In the middle of nowhere, F11, Olympus Mall, the Olympus Mall. Look at the lighting, look at the colouring. It's unbelievable. Pakistan's in the hall. I'm going down there, they'll pass on. Zindabad. Allah Bishaki Abku. Take care. Shabash. Zindabad. Look at it. Centaurus Mall, the best mall in Islamabad. 40 years I've been wearing Adidas. Adidas is the best brand in the world. Look, I'm a rolling bottle with you. Adidas touches, Adidas trainers. I paid these 100. Yeah? Pakistan Zindabad. Alright. You've got Big Ben there. Yeah, you've got different places, you've got windmills in the background, and all different. The Balshai Mosque, wooden work. This is the new project from Centaurus, Art Residential. Okay, don't want to go too far inside, but you've got 5 days. In the background, you've got Fun City. So for the children, there's lots of things to do. Okay, we're at the most important part of Centaurus, the food court. You've got chachadis,